Hi folks, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 33, and in this episode I want to take on the monster that is Clowns and Jugglers, or The Octopus by Mr. Syd Barrett. Now, this is a lyrically packed song, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to kind of run through it. Luckily, I don't have to run through it entirely from scratch. As we mentioned previously, I believe in our introductory video, there is an article by Mr. Paul Belbin, and I'm not sure if he's a scholar or not, but he has broken down, I would say, most of the influences in this song. There are some things that he has missed, I believe, and I'll kind of point those out, but I believe his article on Untangling the Octopus is kind of a must-have if you want to understand the lyrical input and the literary references that Mr. Barrett is utilizing and making throughout the course of the lyrics of this song. So I will suggest a website that I found that has Mr. Belbin's article kind of broken down in it. It's T and then Texas, Texs without an A, so T Texas and then hexes, hexes.blogspot.com from 2011. And this person kind of discusses or runs through Mr. Belbin's his breakdown of the octopus itself, and apparently this says that Untangling the Octopus, and then posted by Julian Palacios. And of course, Mr. Palacios we know already from Dark Globe, the book that he wrote that we often reference in our discussions. And so I'm just following through with kind of what's written here for the basic points, and I think most of these points are very, very correct. And I'm going to point out two or three things that are original to this discussion that I'm putting together that are not recognized within Mr. Belbin's analysis. And I think they are very important things. I don't know necessarily that everyone would agree, but to me, they are very important things. So those are the things that I mainly want to discuss. So let's move on then. Let's discuss a few things. First is, as we normally do, kind of introductions and corrections and things. So the first is that we do have quite a few new people that have joined. So thank you, and thank you for your patience. Hopefully this series is something that most people get quite a bit of enjoyment out of, is discussing and considering influences of Mr. Barrett and influences by Mr. Barrett on other works of art, and specifically in the music scene. So the first thing is, in our Did Syd series, and I've been working on that for a while, and I do suggest that you check that out. I think it's pretty good. It's some of the best work I've done, I think. The analysis of Dark Side of the Moon and Dark Side of Oz. And that was a 3-part series, kind of. And I have one more episode still to do for that, which is going to be kind of just a wrap-up. It's not going to be as intense, but if you're going to watch any of those episodes, I'll suggest episode 1 and 3. At any rate, Domine made a comment that another thing that kind of ties in with the prism of the cover of Dark Side of the Moon is the fractal image on the cover of Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And of course, the fractal kind of view is something that you get when you look through a prism. So yeah, I definitely think that's an interesting kind of a connection. The other thing that was mentioned was Sarashana mentioned that the Mr. Waters, in a discussion, and I'm not sure where this discussion was, but he talks about the line "lunatics are on the grass" from Dark Side of the Moon, and that being tied to, I believe, signs that are posted around Cambridge about stay off the grass, and how people that are kind of maybe antisocial or lunatics or walking their own way, they would be the ones that would actually walk on the grass. And perhaps there's something to that. I certainly do agree. In our breakdown of Did Syd Dark Side of Oz, we specifically mentioned that the lunatic could of course be a reference to the scarecrow, and that the grass, of course, grass is a form of corn. So that could be, and that lyric actually comes up at the same time that the scarecrow is coming from the grass or the corn in Wizard of Oz. So totally up to you. You view it however you want. And of course, the implication would be that perhaps there's more going on than we know, and the person has to decide whether or not they are willing to trust the sources that are relaying messages. So if a person is inclined to believe everything that Mr. Waters says, then that's one way of looking at it. And if people are inclined to think that there may be a double meaning or perhaps something else going on, then you'll have to decide on your own. So let's go ahead then and start our discussion on Clowns and Jugglers, which was the initial name of this. Now, it was recorded May of 68 through June of 69, kind of off and on, and it was released as a single in November of 69. This was before Madcap Laughs album was released, and it was on the Madcap Laughs album as well. There was apparently a special single release in France with an octopus kind of a liner, which is pretty cool. I've never seen that. I would definitely like to see that. But let's look at the name first off. The original name, Clowns and Jugglers, doesn't directly tie in too much with the actual lyrics of the song. Of course, Octopus does, right? Close our eyes to the octopus ride. That is a very specific line in both versions, and the two versions really don't vary too much. Now, in our series, we've already discussed what rustic implications could be for clowns, and jugglers, of course, would tie in with fairs and like midsummer fairs and fairgrounds. That definitely is possible, so it makes sense. And Mr. Belbin does specifically state that he believes that this specific song is written about a couple of experiences that may have involved a playground. So, or a fairground, I'm sorry, not a playground. So let's kind of go through the lyrics here. I'm going to read through them with you. I'm going to look through them and we'll discuss what some of Mr. Belbin's ideas are, kind of for each one of these. And I think when you're done, you'll begin to realize how very, very special a brain Mr. Barrett had. Now, because I've been looking online at some things, I've seen some kind of mean comments to people like about Mr. Chapman and some other people, and I don't really get it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can realize that there are very interesting and special aspects about someone and still not have a completely clouded judgment about that person. And I'm a little confused why people are always so interested in making sure that there's negative things to be said. Of course, there are negative things to be said. Everyone has faults. Nobody's perfect. Not even a Roman. So perhaps at times I'm giving the impression that I think that Mr. Barrett is a saint or something, and I certainly hope that's not the case. I have on numerous occasions said or tried to point to things that are balanced and allow people to kind of make their own judgments. All I can judge based on the work is that he was very lyrically talented. So, and perhaps in other ways as well, with timing and time itself, as we've mentioned in the Did Syd series. So let's go ahead and start looking through things. Now, Mr. Belbin mentions that in 1963, Mr. Barrett had taken a trip of some sort to a fairground, and that there were various rides, including an octopus ride. And so in his opinion, a lot of this just kind of ties in with the paintings that he saw there and the rides that he saw, and that certainly would seem to kind of set a mood. I will point out that there is an interview with Mr. Barrett about this song, which is fairly rare. I'll kind of put it up here, but basically it involves the idea that in his mind, these lines are kind of tied to one another and a theme. So we have to understand there's a kind of a theme that's going on with this specific song. What that theme could be, or if it is only one theme, we'll have to decide after we go through things. But of course, people would kind of have to make that decision based on their own. So there are two kinds of stories that I would like to point out. The first we already discussed is that when Mr. Barrett was kind of younger, he he was at a fairgrounds with someone that he cared about. And later on, I believe in California, he went to a deserted kind of a fairground. And perhaps that was also a little bit odd and might have impressed upon him. So I'll just make that mention here. And it's in the article. You can read through it. But I'll just make the designation here that there were two kind of influences that we have already noted. One is with someone, and then one is kind of with some other people, and it's just deserted, and you have to recognize the contrast that exists there. So the first thing is the very beginning of this. Mr. Belbin runs through. He specifically cites out where trip to, heave and ho might come from, fro, to and fro. The line, you have no word, doesn't really come from anywhere. That idea, I have no idea where that comes from. Now, there's a mention of a trip, and we've specifically mentioned a psychedelic idea of a trip and a dream dragon. Now, Mr. Belbin mentions that there was a kind of a sea dragon ride, so perhaps this is just a reference to a sea dragon, but of course we've seen many references to dreams within Mr. Barrett's music, and also the idea of floating, flying, tripping, dreaming. Those things are consistent within his music, and it's here. The idea of hiding your wings and in a ghost tower is specifically called out by Mr. Belbin, and he also discusses the very specific idea of the next line about sails cackling. So, and that is a kind of a variation on the sails crackling. So crackling versus sails cackling. And I just want to point out that the sails cackling is much more interesting to me anyway, and it's a little bit spooky. It's a little bit weird, and it's a little bit malicious in a way, and I kind of like that. Mr. Barrett does that. He seems to have this kind of an ability to take something and take it from being really cleaned up to what a lot of stories used to be like the idea of the Little Mermaid. So the Little Mermaid has of course been cleaned up, but if you read the very old forms of the Little Mermaid, you see that it's a really terrible tale, and it's intended to be that way as a warning to people. So at any rate, children's tales and children's stories used to be quite a bit more dire and dark than they are now. So there's a little minute gong and some other things that are kind of called out. The idea of Mr. Nobody is discussed, and Mr. Belbin kind of runs through most of the very specific lines of this entire verse. So this idea of a little minute gong, coughing, clearing his throats, and then someone standing before you, and this carnival barker kind of idea, and hey, he'll never be still, favorite, grand, etc. These are all things that Mr. Belbin specifically points to in his article, so I'm not going to run through them other than to say that he has discussed them. The next thing that he mentions is trip to and then heave and ho, so he breaks that down. And then the very specific line of please leave us here. So I want to kind of point out the very specific strangeness of this line, and that is because it is plural. So why would Mr. Barrett be saying please leave us here? I'm just going to leave that as a question now, because I would say that's almost like the royal use of a plural. Who is us? Who are we? Why is Mr. Barrett using an us here? The assumption then is, of course, that he's with someone or with other people, but then why are they feeling the same way? And of course, later in this song, later in this very, very specific song, we might be able to figure out kind of what's going on. Why is this plural there? That's one of the first questions I want to ask. Why is that plural there? Mr. Belbin doesn't get into it too much, but we will. Okay, then there's a whole bunch of references about being lost in the wood and the nature of being lost in the woods, and I want to specifically kind of point to a line now that is very, very important to me. Okay, this is where I'm going to make a connection, and I'm going to draw our second question. And Mr. Belbin doesn't seem to catch this one. The first line is, isn't it good to be lost in the wood? And then something about, isn't it bad to be quiet there lost in the wood? And then very, very specifically, these next two lines. It meant even less to me than I thought. So something means less. So what could mean less? That's our second question. What is meaning less? Our third question is the next line. Literally, the construction of the next line. Clover honeypots and mystic shining feed. Now, Mr. Belbin specifically ties this to poetry by Mr. Clare. And his breakdown specifically kind of tears through this with a few words by Mr. John Clare, and those are from Fairy Things. He mentions are filled with mystic shining seed and that ripen into prickly seeds. So there's reference of mystic shining and prickly seeds, which of course is kind of in those two lines of with a honey plow of yellow prickly seeds, and then clover honeypots and mystic shining feed. But where are the rest of those kind of put together? Well, he has another line there about and fairy money pots. So there are certain words that certainly do kind of tie in with this, but not in totality. So there are words that are missing. And as we have noted with Mr. Barrett, he has a tendency to combine two things or three things into one. So what I'm going to propose to you is that it is possible that there is another influence kind of here. Okay? Let's continue on. So that'll kind of be the idea there is what is the third source for the third question is what is the source that ties in together with that combination? And let's continue on then. The next line mentions that a madcap is laughing at a man on the border. And I want to point out that, of course, previously, now Mr. Belbin does kind of discuss this idea of a man on the border. And I want to point out that, of course, this could be a moment where Mr. Barrett is pointing to two aspects of himself, thus the pronoun us. So that may be the question on the plurality of the use of the word us or we, is that he's actually broken himself down into two specific people. He is a madcap and a man on the border at the same time. Why would that be the case? Well, we'll answer that kind of as we get into our context and we answer the other two questions. The rest of the song kind of continues on, and you can certainly read about it. The only other thing of note that I will mention is that the madcap is laughing at the man on the border, and then hey ho huff the Talbot. Now, Mr. Belbin specifically mentions that Talbot is possibly a mention of Shakespeare's Lord Talbot, and we have done numerous breakdowns of Shakespeare, so this certainly is possible. We have mentioned that it is highly likely that Mr. Barrett was interested in and was using Shakespeare, and Talbot is, of course, from, I thought it was Henry IV, but he has here Henry VI. So I'm not certain now. I thought it was Henry IV. So at any rate, I thought it was Henry IV and Henry V. I'll have to verify. I'll go verify. So at any rate, there's a mention there of Shakespeare. And I'll end this kind of breakdown. You can go through and do the rest. But really, I want to answer now the questions that remain. So we have our three questions. One is, why is there a plural being used for us? And very rarely does Mr. Barrett refer to himself, but specifically here he's saying leave us here. And then he references two characters later on, which appears to be similar to the song Lucifer Sam, where he seems to be mentioning different influences almost within himself. Certainly possible. The second question, of course, is what are the possible combinations of words that tie in with the two lines that we specifically called out. It meant even less to me than thought. What meant less, and what is the source of that? So in order to do that, I'm going to have to point you to something that I found out. Now, after I finished doing the Did Syd Dark Side of Oz, I specifically in the third episode mentioned that if you continue watching the movie itself, after the Tin Man has kind of woken up, there is a very specific Romeo reference where a voice kind of comes in and says, "Wherefore art thou, Romeo," or something like that. And that made me think, of course, all this time I've been breaking down Shakespeare, but I haven't even bothered to look at Romeo and Juliet. And part of the reason is because I don't like Romeo and Juliet. I don't like it as a play, personally. But I will kind of say Mr. Barrett may have. And we've mentioned that there are possible love interests and possible, let's call it extreme devotion, or perhaps young love that's kind of gone a little bit too far. And that, of course, is the very plot of Romeo and Juliet. So I will point to you then just to a few things that I found. The first is that in Act 5, Scene 1, line 46, the words very specifically state green earthen pots, bladders, and musty seeds. So there we can see, if we combine that line of green earthen pots, and Mr. Barrett uses clover honey pots and mystic shining feed, but of course Shakespeare uses musty seeds. Seeds is the line preceding that for Mr. Barrett, with a honey plow of yellow prickly seeds. And so all you have to do is take aspects of Mr. Clare's poetry and mix it with Shakespeare, and you can get most of the word combinations that are used in these two lines. So why would Mr. Barrett be using, now that we've identified another possible source, and I'll just point out that Mr. Belbin didn't apparently catch this line in Shakespeare, and maybe I just caught it by luck, I don't know. Maybe other people have seen it, I don't know. But I will point out that I feel very strongly that most people can pick up on different aspects of things that Mr. Barrett was kind of working on that even very intelligent and scholarly people might miss. So I think this is a worthwhile activity, not just for me, but for everyone. So what would be the cause of what is the context of this? Let's put it like that. What is the context of this note? Why would Mr. Barrett kind of be pointing to this? Well, let's read. I'm going to read you a number of things, okay? Romeo says, the very first line of this kind of soliloquy, he says, "No matter, get thee gone." Well, isn't that funny? Because the lyric just before then says, "It meant even less to me than I thought." And Romeo is specifically saying, "No matter, get thee gone." In other words, it doesn't matter to me. Hire those horses, I'll be with thee straight. And he says, "Well, Juliet, I will lie with thee tonight. Let's see for means. O mischief, thou art swift to enter in the thoughts of desperate men. I do remember an apothecary, and hereabouts a dwells, which late I noted in tattered weeds with overwhelming brows. Culling of simples, meager were his looks, sharp misery had worn him to the bones, and in his needy shop a tortoise hung." So there's a tortoise reference. "An alligator stuffed and other skins of ill-shaped fishes." Quite a few songs about fishes in the song Terrapin. "And about his shelves a beggarly account of empty boxes, green earthen pots, bladders, and musty seeds, etc." So what is the news that Mr. Romeo is saying, no matter? Well, he has just been made aware that Juliet is dead. So Juliet is dead, and his response is that it is of little matter. No matter, get thee gone. And right here, Mr. Barrett is giving that exact same theme, that exact same idea. It meant even less to me than I thought, with a honey plow of yellow prickly seeds, clover honey pots, and mystic shining feed. Now, I want to kind of point out here that the clover honey pots, of course, could be a metaphor, and that could be a sexual form of a metaphor. I just want to point that out, as well as the yellow prickly seeds. So, I don't know necessarily that that's happening, but we have mentioned before that Mr. Barrett likes to speak in metaphor, and that quite often he does apparently do so. Of course, you can never know what someone else's metaphors mean, but he does apparently do so as a means towards expressing in a more, I don't know, beautiful way, a more poetic way, physical things of people. So there now, we have answered quite a few things, not only where this may have come from and how it's organized, but now we kind of might have a reason why. And now we also possibly have a reason for the poem itself or the song itself, not just to express the experience of the rides and the enjoyment. And I will point out, of course, that octopus ride also could be a form of a sexual metaphor, of course, because puss is often tied with female, as in pussy cat instead of just cat. So, of course, this could be overall a recognition of perhaps a relationship that's now gone empty. And if you want, you can go back and watch our Peeling Syd Barrett episode on apples and oranges, and specifically what seems to have happened during the American tour trip. And if that is the case, then of course the visit to the now empty fairgrounds in the United States and California would have been a little bit of an appropriate visual for the loss of a relationship and a reminder for the loss of a relationship, which is consistent with Romeo and Juliet at that point in time. So that's pretty much what I wanted to deliver on the song itself. Now, what I would like to do next is just kind of go through the context itself of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and I'll point out a few other things that are interesting, and perhaps they'll be interesting to you as well. Okay? So, the first thing that I want to kind of point out is that in the very beginning of this, and this is, let's see, Act 1, Scene 1, Romeo specifically says, this is line 162 perhaps or so around there, he says, "Ay me, sad hours seem long. Was that my father that went hence so fast?" His friend replies, "It was. What sadness lengthens Romeo's hours?" And Romeo replies, not having that which makes them short." And his friend says, "In love," and Romeo says, "Out." His friend says, "Of love," and Romeo says, "Out of her favor, where I am in love." So an unrequited love. So I just want to point out that in the very beginning of this story, Romeo is indicating that he is susceptible to unbalanced love. That's already happened in the very beginning of this. And perhaps that is in a way something that is attractive, or is in a way something that is not only indicative of the overall romantic ideal, but also maybe an aspect of Mr. Barrett's character. Just to point that out. The next, continuing on for some lines, I'm looking at line 190. Romeo says, "Love is a smoke made with the fume of sighs, being purged, a fire sparkling in lovers' eyes, being vexed, a sea nourished with loving tears. What is it else? A madness most discreet, a choking gall and a preserving sweet. Farewell, my coz." So, right there, Romeo is specifically pointing to the idea of madness, but not only madness, but a kind of inner madness, one that is often hushed up or kept silent or kept to oneself, for obvious reasons. Romeo continues on, 198, "Tut, I have lost myself, I am not here, this is not Romeo, he is some other where." So we have already discussed this idea of I'm not here, I'm some other place, etc. And it's interesting that that idea keeps coming back up again over and over. I will point to the next the next bit to me that is important is, let's see, scene 4. So Act 1, scene 4. Romeo says in line 10, "Give me a torch. I am not for this ambling, being but heavy, I will bear the light." His friend says, "Nay, gentle Romeo, we must have you dance." And Romeo says, "Not I, believe me, you have dancing shoes with nimble soles. I have a soul of lead, so stakes me to the ground, I cannot move." Line 36 or so, Romeo says, "A torch for me. Let wantons light of heart tickle the senseless rushes with their heels." Line 50 or so, and I'm just pointing out these torch references, of course, because they are in the song. It is obvious, a torch on the porch. So that connection to the idea of signaling with a torch, there are repeated references to torches within Romeo and Juliet. Now here's another interesting few lines. Line 49, Romeo says, "I dreamt a dream tonight. I dreamt a dream tonight." His friend says, "And so did I." And Romeo says, "Well, what was yours?" And his friend says that dreamers often lie. And Romeo says, "In bed asleep, while they do dream things true." And his friend says then, "Oh, then I see Queen Mav hath been with you. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone, on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomi over men's noses as they sleep. Her chariot is an empty hazelnut, made by the joiner, squirrel, or old grub," etc. Now this is all absurd, of course, not only because it is absurd to be talking about a fairy visiting dreams, etc., but because this story is about Italian families, and Mav is a Celtic idea of fairy queen, and so I don't know why. I believe these are Italians would be referencing the idea of Queen Mav, but whatever. That's perhaps an oversight by Shakespeare. So I do want to point out one other thing that's quite interesting about Shakespeare, and that is that if you are a person that has studied Shakespeare at all, you know that there are a number of people that believe it was more than just one writer that was writing Shakespeare. I'm just going to throw that idea out there. Perhaps some Mr. Marlowe may have been working with Shakespeare, etc. But the extreme amount of work that was done alone in and of itself makes one wonder, not just in style, but also in content and volume, if there weren't more than one person doing the writing. We have in the Did Syd series discussed a number of ideas, such as, is it possible that Syd was also working with other people doing writing? The next interesting portion, I will say, is, what is this now? This is scene 5, still Act 1, and I'm at line 44. Romeo says, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright." So, again, another torch reference. I will look at, let's see, Act 2, Scene 2, line 108 or so. Romeo says, "Lady, by yonder blessed moon I vow that tips with silver all these fruit tree tops." So there's our combination of moon with silver again. And line 182, Romeo says, "I would I were thy bird." So there's a reference to, as Mr. Barrett often does, a comparison with himself, like Birdie Hop, the song Birdie Hop, a comparison to a bird. Here is Romeo doing the same thing. I will look next at Act 2, Scene 4. And this is kind of an odd one, but line 58 or so. Well, I'll start with line 54. Romeo says, "Meaning to Circe." His friend says, "Thou hast most kindly hit it." Romeo says, "A most courteous exposition." His friend says, "Nay, I am the very pink of courtesy." And Romeo says, "Pink for flower." His friend replies, "Right." So there's a reference to the color pink, and Romeo identifying himself as Pink. So who is Pink? Well, I know who Pink is now. Pink is Romeo. Well, by the way, which one's Pink? Now you know the answer. It's Romeo. I don't know. It's just an idea. It's kind of a funny one, but okay. So let's continue on then. And the next portion that was interesting to me anyway is Act 3, Scene 3, line 30. Romeo says, "'Tis torture and not mercy. Heaven is here where Juliet lives, and every cat and dog and little mouse, every unworthy thing, live here in heaven, and may look on her, but Romeo may not. More validity, more honorable state, more courtship lives in carrion flies than Romeo. They may seize on the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand, and steal immortal blessing from her lips, who even in pure and vestal modesty still blushes, as thinking their own kisses sin. But Romeo may not, he is banished. Flies may do this, but I from this must fly." So there is a reference to the flies, and of course there are numerous references to flies in Mr. Barrett's lyrics. I've connected that with a number of books and literary possible influences, including Brave New World, and here it is very specifically, and of course it is stated in Jealousy that these lesser beings may spend time with Juliet, but Romeo may not. And perhaps that is what is being referenced by Mr. Barrett himself. The next thing I will point you to is Act 3, Scene 5, line 5. Romeo says, "It was the lark, the herald of the morn." Mr. Barrett often refers to the lark, as do many poets. More interestingly, towards the end, I'll just read you the whole thing and I'll tell you the other interesting bit. "It was the lark, the herald of the morn, no nightingale. Look, love, what envious streaks do lace the severing clouds in yonder east. Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops." So there is a reference to the misty mountain tops, misty riders, climbing, which of course is, I believe, in Matilda Mother. So that right there specifically is here. Let's continue on. I think I'm almost done with my Shakespeare breakdown here of Romeo and Juliet. And I suppose that's pretty much it. The rest of it is, of course, in Act 5, Scene 1, when Romeo believes that Juliet is already dead, and so he goes about his own way towards basically ensuring his own death as well. And if Mr. Barrett was very literal in his reading of these things, and I'm afraid that he may have been the kind of person to have been very literal in these types of readings, I do have to wonder about the safety of his person if he was going through a process like this, and if he was as tied in these ideas as he may have been. At any rate, he did push through, and he did live a very full life, a long life, and I do hope it was a worthwhile life. And in many ways, that's a victory, I suppose, if someone has gone through something, and if he is indeed referencing Romeo and Juliet, and if he is indeed referencing a relationship that was tied to his youth and was beautiful and full of love, and he's tying that with this into the story of this fairground and Midsummer's Eve or whatever, and he's contrasting that with the dearth of his life that existed and perhaps was filling him with sadness during the tour through the United States. In many ways, I hope I'm wrong, but I really don't think I am. I think it may have really hit him pretty hard, and perhaps by putting together this song in this way, he's very specifically annotating the contrast in his life. And of course, many people have gone through a period of time where they realize that the things that they really care about are gone, or many other things are gone, and they have to start over. And it takes a lot of courage and strength to be able to do that. And I don't know if that's what's happening, but I certainly am happy for Mr. Barrett and the Barrett family if he was able to pull through something like that and be happy with his life. Now, there is one lyric that I wanted to discuss that I somewhat forgot, and that is the portion, I forgot to mention this, at the very end of the song for Octopus, he mentions 2 up, 2 down, we'll never meet. So what could that possibly mean? Well, Mr. Belbin discusses the nature of a building that is called two up, two down. And it is called two up, two down because there's no connection between the two. In other words, there's an up and there's a lower. So there's an upper portion and there's a lower portion. And of course, we have mentioned the story of the Tin Man, and we've mentioned Romeo and Juliet as a possible reference. And of course, Romeo and Juliet are torn apart by two separate families that refuse to be connected. The Tin Man is discussing the nature of building a home, but being in love with a beautiful Munchkin girl that is domineered by her own mother, that will not let the two houses combine. That's exactly the same theme that's in Romeo and Juliet. Two houses that refuse to let lovers combine. And of course, two up, two down is a house that is divided and cannot combine. So the theme there is fairly consistent. Perhaps that's what's being referenced. You'll have to decide on your own. Now, I will end with one last thing, okay? And that is that I am absolutely blown away by the similarity in this song and the specific aspects of this song with another song, and that is the song Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel. Now, Peter Gabriel released this in April of '86, and not only is the artwork associated with the video extraordinary for the time, but also I want you to kind of look at a number of things that are called out in this. If you would, pull up the lyrics for Sledgehammer and let's take a look at it. And I just want to point this out, okay? So the first is, now there are an extreme amount of metaphors that are going to be kind of joking sexual metaphor within this song Sledgehammer. And we just ran through a song that may be doing the same thing. So the first is, you could have a steam train and you have to lay down tracks. Now, we've already mentioned in Pink Floyd songs the mention of a rail, and of course in the Wish You Were Here album there will be another mention of a rail. Here it is, the idea of a rail, but it's not called a rail, it's called tracks. So steam train, tracks, and of course that is alliteration on the T and the S sound. There's a mention of an airplane flying. You can have an airplane flying if you just bring your blue skies back, and all you have to do is call me. Now, there are various Barrett songs, of course, that mention calling. So sitting by the phone, being by the phone, calling, waiting. I used to be able to call you, used to call, etc., and you'd be here. Let's continue on. The next line is pretty funny. You could have a big dipper. Now, dipper, of course, is not only an astronomical reference, but it is also a word that is going to possibly be referring to a male. So it rhymes with Big Dipper, rhymes with big. You figure it out, okay? And that I guess you could say that disguised form is pretty interesting. The next line is about going up and down and all around the bends. Of course, that would be a possible metaphor for intercourse. The next line is, you can have a bumper car, and this amusement never ends. Well, we just ran through a whole song that was about nothing but amusement, never ending amusement, and different rides that you could go on. And we mentioned the fact that an octopus ride could, of course, be a metaphor for intercourse. And here is exactly the same theme. So I'll let you kind of mess with that. I guess if you want, you can read through all of it. It's pretty straightforward. Let me see what. Well, let's keep going. So there's a bit about Sledgehammer. That one's pretty obvious. I don't want to get to that, but he mentions. He says, "Show me around your fruit cage, because I will be your honeybee." Well, isn't that interesting? There's a mention of a fruit cage, which of course would possibly be a metaphor for a female. As we just mentioned, clover honey pots and yellow prickly seeds can of course be exactly the same metaphor. So open up your fruit cage where the fruit is sweet as can be. Well, I don't know what to tell you, but of course, the theme of the metaphors is extremely similar. Now, let's go on to the next verse here, where Mr. Gabriel says that he's... Notice the words here. He mentions that he's kicked a habit. What habit has he kicked? I don't know. Are there habits to be kicked? Shed my skin. Well, okay, and this is the new stuff. Well, Mr. Gabriel, to be fair, was trying out some new types of music. And if you try out some new kinds of music, then you have also kind of shed your skin. But it's all very suspicious to me, and it's a wonderful bit of metaphor and metaphorical lyric writing that I have seen before, and is very consistent with themes that do kind of tie in with Mr. Barrett. So I do hope to eventually get into the idea of perhaps Mr. Barrett influencing Mr. Gabriel or something else going on. Perhaps I'll put that together later. I just want to point out, if you like Peter Gabriel and the song Sledgehammer, compare it with this song, Octopus by Syd Barrett. Consider what you're reading and notice the similarities. So that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will talk to you later.